No.
Hello. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It's when we have this demonization on political standpoint where we prop change and prop discourse for more people to be able to opt into political literacy. Now, first, let's just look at the counterfactual and characterization of this debate. What does this demonization actually look like, right? When people don't opt into actually going towards these political standpoints, people will call them out, right? They'll actively say they're causing harm when they don't talk about these things. They don't care we say that on government side, right? We don't care what side they are on. As long as they have a side, we say that is a benefit towards our side of the house. And we said that the majority has to take a political stance. And we say that it's done in a healthy manner. Look at things like in status quo, where people talk about it in Reddit, like where they say like they prefer Kamala Harris over Trump, right? No, we say that it's done in a healthy manner because people are more likely, when you have that social narrative, to be able to be okay with this. And I'll further explain this on my first argument, right? Now, what does these social issues look like, right? It looks like the government's oppressing minorities, making bad policy making by the government, or corruption, or having conflict in the government. For example, Israel and Palestine. We say that when you have this demonization, more people are prone to talk about these social issues because there is an incentive for them to do so. Now, what's the trade-off that we have to take in today's debate? What's the burden that we take in today's debate? We just have to simply prove that there's more ability for public discourse and we can get tangible results or more awareness from this discourse. Now, this brings me to my first argument, right? Why we get more discourse? Because when we have discourse, more individuals take a stance. We say that they'll discuss, there's a human nature for them to discuss it with other people, because when it's the narrative to do so, for you to show your political stance, then people will start talking about it with other humans, and they need to share share each other. Which means that there's more discussions on things like Reddit or forums, and that there will always be a more concrete stance for what individuals actually believe in. So we say that there's going to be a fluidity when you take a side. Because note that we're not saying that these individuals cannot switch sides. We're just saying that we want to prop a healthy discourse where they can talk about their political standpoints, and we say that these individuals can switch sides whenever they want, and they have to manage. They have to like convince problem. They can like talk about problems and social issues. Like before that, any of you want?
How does demonization look like on your side, and doesn't it directly contradict healthy discussion?
No, we say that demonization looks like them being able to go into these political standpoints, and if like let's say like you have a neutral person, right? If they don't opt into these political views, then we say that they're going to be demonized for not taking a stand. And on point of negative discourse, I'll explain that later on. So what's the problem with social issues now in status quo? It's because people have never want to actually take a stance in status quo, right? Because when there's always like in modern culture where people always are like keyboard warriors, or like they'll always lash out on you when you take a political standpoint, we say that is the best way for them to opt into being neutral and not talk about these topics, because they feel as if they're going to be criticized, or they're going to be criticized by other people. But when we have this demonization in place, it's actually the amnesty that comes into opting into these things that gives them the power to actually talk about these subjects and talk about discourse. All individuals, and we say that all individuals have to have a stance, and they have to choose which side they're on. So what's the impact in here? Well, first, a mechanization of why people become more tolerant with negative discourse when you opt into this, right? Because it's the narrative norm. Like, again, mentioned by last time, just modern society always had this cancel culture, and staying neutral has become the norm. So when people always talk about discourse, and when people always talk about political views, then it becomes a norm to say, to agree with all things, and take into account of all things, which leads to more solutions to political problems. And why we say that we can concede the fact that negative discourse isn't as bad, is because negative discourse is still discussion, right? It brings awareness up from things that are so bad. Like, for example, if minorities had had no say, negative discourse is still good, because even if they went against the minorities, these issues are still being brought out in conversation, and more people will be incentivized to know about these. Whereas opposed on their side, right, they just have these individuals just do not care about these minorities at all. So let's just look at the comparative here fast. So then, on their side of the house, individuals stay silent because of controversy. They maintain neutral because they're afraid that they can't opt into it. Whereas on our side, right, individuals always have differentiating opinions, and this becomes the status quo. Why we say that's so important is because when individuals become more tolerant, it can lead to it solves political issues. Let's take this as an example, right? Let's say I'm in a conservative town and I have no oppression. There's no difference maker. There's nobody to talk me down because they feel like taking a neutral stance is what's going to benefit them the most. And just to expand on that minority benefit, right? They have no representation in modern society today. So when these minorities actually have the power to talk about what's going on in their place, like the reason they don't want to right now is because they feel like nobody will side with them, because nobody really cares about minorities, nobody really cares about their political representation. When we have that amnesty for them, it allows for them to opt in. Now, even if opposition wants to argue that sometimes this is bad for them, like people won't agree, we say that it's still going to be backlogged and people will come into it, and there's this sets a precedent for them to actually look at things like minority issues or controversy, right? On the second argument of political literacy, right? More people will research and more people will have better knowledge of politics. Now, I think that the impact is quite the issue. Like the issue is directly impacted is that it gives people more of a political stance. And why that's so important is because when individuals become more exposed to it, they gain political efficacy. Why do you need political efficacy in this type of world then? Because when you gain political efficacy, you prevent things like corruption being so harmful. Why? Because people become more accountable for these politicians, because when they do anything corrupt, more people will be updated on it as opposed to like being completely in the dark. And two, why is in the status quo that corruption is so easy is because they always overcrowd these people underground with information, and it leads to them not being able to consume it. And that's why we mitigate it on our side of the house. And with that, that's it.
Alright, thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Hello. Can I not use the mic? Is it okay or whatever? Give me a second. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2. Social issues is the ammunition for politics in their campaign. We say that what proposition does is actively makes healthy discussion worse and hurt the movements down the line. We don't want to make a fragile discussion worse, especially when it comes to giving political campaigns even more political ammunition to hurt their social movements more. And we say that this is something that's very likely. And so, further proving more setup when it comes to what OG has really missed out. What does demonization actively look like, and who are the people that actually remain neutral? Demonization actively is shaming those that do not take sides, and this still looks like people who are 3 things. 1, they are completely uninformed of the situation at all. 2, think people who are informed and think of this type of social movements as something that's very politically, very great. They think they can't understand both sides of the story, and thirdly, doesn't want to get attacked by the people who are actively taking sides already. We say that we say that what our argument, the two argumentations that we'll be forwarding will help these people down the line. And what is our burden then? Our only burden within this debate is not making things worse on the opposition side, because we believe that demonization will actively lead to further worsening of a healthy discussion, and secondly, how this funnels into other things like political parties having ammunition, and vocal minorities who demonize others, people who already don't support you will actively hate you even further. And this will all be further proved within my two substantives. But firstly, moving on to the response then. So what is like more discourse, like how they try to tell you about how there's actively going to be more discourse, and this leads, and we tell you that this will actively worsen discourse when it comes to having, this is actively not true, because this leads to things like desensitization to the general mass, towards the general masses, and towards these types of issues down the line. My second speaker will further give you analysis on this. And two argumentations then, firstly on how this will provide political parties with even more political ammunition, and secondly, how demonization allows for more resources to put in advocacy. So these two argumentations, responses will be incorporated. So firstly, on how this does not provide further political ammunition. When you're actively demonizing, when you are actively very vocal about these situations, how people will react generally are either they'll be mad or scared into thinking that they need to take a side within this sorts of issues. So why this is true is very simple. The illustration is when people are vocal, they pressure you who are informed or who aren't informed to actively want to be informed about your side and to take a stance on this type of social movements. So they feel like they are waiting for things they had and hadn't done in the first place. And we tell you this demonization actively makes them feel worse about themselves. And this gives political parties ammunition further and the needed critical mass against the social movement to actually try to buy these people who are originally on the fence, which are majority of the times going to be the majority of individuals, are to be able to persuade them down the line. Sure.
Does demonization occur for both people trying violent movements and also political parties?
Yes. Okay, why this is likely is the social justice movement, most of them take place in the context of Western liberal democracies, and the ones in power are normally going to be people who are more conservative and older side, because actively most of social movements and most of the social discussions are going to be within this type of context. But why this is so important then? This leads to three primary impacts. Firstly, on how this will lead to further polarization and how things will become even worse. So why this is the case is because when it comes to these types of discourse, it will lead to it is actively a negative form of discourse, because you're actively having this demonizing these individuals into one, forcing them into a side or the other, and these will further lead to politics and campaigns having more destructive claims towards each other. And why this is the case is very simple. Is because you're trying to persuade the majority of these individuals who are on the neutral stance into coming into the political coming into the party and supporting them. And secondly, people that are more on the fence are not going to be even convinced in the first place, because we tell you that when these types of demonizations occur, people who are going to take one side or the other are more likely to be entrenched within their own beliefs, because at the end of the day, the more you try to demonize them, the more you try to take them, have them come over to your side. When you actively have them leave or actively have them actively change your opinions on something, then this will lead to a net negative for the individual, because you leaving will be seen as you're betraying them, and you coming in will be seen as someone that is not actually within your thoughts and in your social movement. So thirdly, people who are informed don't even want to take the stance in the first place even further, because they don't want to feel they don't want to be within this discussion, because it is so negative and because, well, it is not something that you want to be a part of anymore. So what is even if people on their best case, people are more convinced and people are likely to take a stance and buy into a rhetoric of more morally righteous side within the social movement, we say that the comparison is very simple. It is harder on proposition because one side becomes more radical, so does its opposition. And we tell you when both sides of a social movement become further entrenched, it will be even further impossible to actually create change, because both the opposition and the social movement itself will be strong will be strong in a way that is hard to like change other people's mindsets. And we say that it is in the best interest of social justice movement to fight for grassroots change, do things like do things that currently within status quo, do things like advocacy, but without the added demonization. We say that is enough. And even if we have less discourse, at least we are making conflict within the social justice movement worse. And second argumentation on how not demonizing allows for more resources to put into advocacy. So what is the premise of this then? Social justice movements inherently have a limited amount of resources within status quo because they need to be able to convince the most amount of people within a giant mass in their society. And the example of this is sporadic grassroots movements, etc. They have less money and as such chooses to focus on more important things. And we say you have to be smart when it comes to advocacy because you have to focus your advocacy into a specific place to be able to get the most effective amount of support and change in the first place. And you'll be able to have more people fighting for your movement and focus on and at the very least you're dissuading people from fighting via being loud and fighting via just being loud and being extremely like demonizing them. So we tell you that this is still be better, and here's why we still win on the best case. Even if you do manage to put resources into advocacy, the people who are demonizing other people will still be in the limelight, and you supersede the positive advocacy that already exists within status quo, and further impacts and further illustration and responsibility for your life.
Thank you, leader of the speech. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Reciprocate the love.
Before I start my speech, a few shout-outs. Firstly, eitan. Secondly, Audrey. Thank you for that. And thirdly, Jonathan. I know that's not the best. That's what matters, We're still friends. I think we're all friends. I think side OG stands for something that extends far beyond an individual's needs. I think side OG was the one that created a culture of revolution, one of change in which individuals are finally incentivized to voice the opinions that have been oppressed for so long. That in a society in which cancel culture and the ideas of the minority are often oppressed, when you have people failing to engage in political discussion because they're afraid of what the community might say to them, because they're afraid of what other people perceive them as, that the ability to give these people a voice and encourage them to do things like opt into research, like opt into, gaining their own personal stance, was the most important and proximate tool to provide to them. So, two things in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to take down the entire OO case and how people victimize themselves and therefore don't want to opt into these changes in the first place. Secondly, I'm going to move on to a new extension as to how we create a culture of revolution that uniquely empowers minorities on the ground. So firstly then, I'll take down the OO case. So what they tell us is that people don't want to engage in this kind of discussions because they feel like they're being blamed for things that they didn't do. That parties are then going to divide the people using things like rhetoric. I think two responses. Firstly, I think it's fundamentally untrue that individuals are always going to be blamed, that are feeling like they're blamed for things that they didn't do, right? So in no part of Jonathan's speech do we tell you, you have to take a very strong stance on these issues. So that means you have to go into a Palestine march in order to prove that you're taking a stance on these issues. We think it's perfectly acceptable for you to be able to do things like post it on your story or just have just say that, oh, I support Palestine as a whole when people ask you about it. It didn't necessarily mean that obviously the most extreme acts of support. No, I'll say that later.
But I think furthermore, right, I think it was on our side of the house where every individual probably holds their own opinion, right? So even if you don't directly support things like LGBTQ plus rights, we think there's always some sort of righteousness within you to defend your personal beliefs. So if I believe that minorities shouldn't be oppressed, I probably then do things like sympathize with the oppressed like racial minorities, or I sympathize with oppressed gender minorities. So we think that every individual had some form of opinion in the first place. But secondly, right, I want to flip this entire idea about dividing the people. Because we think it's okay for things like negative discourse to happen. We think it happens on both sides of the house. We find to have, politically polarized people. But what was the most important was your capability to deal with that. Because no, it was on their side of the house where parties have even more power over the people. The point at which they were politically disempowered, right? So when you're afraid of your community calling you up for having a certain viewpoint, it's that on their side of the house, controversial issues either A, get buried under this idea that I don't want to talk about it because I'm too scared of retribution, or B, the fact that parties have more power because they can do things like opt into populist rhetoric instead of because of the fact you're fundamentally unaware, because you haven't done things like do the research in order to gain your own political stance. And this is when you gain politicians the ability to sway the vast majority of people. No, on our side of the house, the mechanism for how you prevent this is extremely simple. So when you get these controversial issues in the first place, before the government even reach you, before these parties can even reach you, you're more inclined, because you want to get this stance, to do prior research, to find out what stance best accommodates to your own set of beliefs and your own ideals. We think that was when on our side of the house, we gained the political literacy that Jonathan talks to you about that is fundamentally unresponded to from opening opposition. The reason this was extremely important was because it was a benefit regardless of the outcome. So even if discourse happens, whether it's good or whether it's bad, we think the important thing for individuals is the ability to access more information and to have them incentivized to access information from things like third-party sources that are unrelated and are more relatively unbiased compared to on their side of the house where parties got even further sway. Before I move on, I'll take the point.
When a woman has to take a stance on feminism, no matter which stance she takes, she's going to be demonized by 100 other individuals. Why don't you care about this?
Okay, cool. I'm going to take this on in my section, right? How you get critical mass to protect minorities from the demonization from wider society. Right. Okay, before that, right? The last thing they tell us is that individuals don't want to opt into discussion because they feel they're scared. I want to weigh this on scale, right? Think about it this way. On opening opposition, the vast amount of minorities, because of the reason they point out in their POI, the fact that they're going to be demonized means minorities often don't opt into discussion in the first place because of that fundamental fear. So what it means is on a basis of scale, I think on our side, we're generally able to get more discourse and more individuals into it. Really, regardless of the quality of that discourse, the fact that more individuals were aware of it led to the capability for change. So you get things like discussion about indigenous issues that go in like rural villages, which creates political awareness. That this becomes then part of like the party's policy lines and policy agenda that allow you to create change by prompting these issues in parliament that then allows you to pass legislation. But I'm going to move on to the extension, and that's how we create a culture of revolution. I think the premise is simple. The reason things like cultural reform and revolts from the most ignored and oppressed in society was the fact that in the majority of cases you struggle to create critical mass. So because of things like the societal demonization of like minority movements, there are individuals within these movements in the status quo that feel afraid to speak out about their actual truths and about their actual identity because they're always scared of being oppressed. Really, the point which shows that socially ingrained fear of embracing yourself, that I think this is like the point at which you had this ingrained fear of facing yourself, you were unable to create change. So first layer then is how we create a more tolerant society in general. I think Jonathan already points this out to you in his speech. On our side of the house, the permission mechanisms change over time. So you have a norm of opinion that individuals should be opinionated, which then exposes you to further perspective. Why is this crucially important within this debate? Because look, right, the reason minorities don't speak out is because they often feel isolated, that other people in society are unable to relate to them. The comparative on our side then becomes these minorities feel as though every other minority has that same sense of oppression within them, that they're more incentivized to speak out on it because they know that other people, other minorities, aren't going to leave them alone and aren't going to isolate them. So in the status quo where you had things like, African Americans in the past that worked with their enslavers, or had a neutral stance because they were afraid of the harms that would come with reform, the backlash that would come with them. That meant that the fight for rights and the fight for equality was one that was greatly fractured and one that took much longer than it needed to. So on our side of the house, what you're able to do, since you're able to expose them to more range of opinions, is that you probably are able to create a society in which people are more open to them. But I want to think on the worst case here. So sure, let's say the majority doesn't accept you. How do we still enable change? I think if we created leeway for things like radical leaders or for things like minority leaders to get the most collectivization, right? So when we think about leaders like Malcolm X, the reason that they're effective is because they're able to prompt collectivization. They allow the majority of individuals within society So on our side of the house, when you empower individuals to embrace their true opinion, I think this is when you further created this change and further enabled it, because these leaders are given more leeway. The impacts then are threefold. Firstly, I think we empowered radical change, right? Because the most oppressed feel a sense of safety and society that allows them to opt into things like voting, and engaging with political issues. That's how you shut down things like voter apathy that exists in status quo, because individuals feel fundamentally politically disempowered. Secondly, I think we flip the entire idea of advocacy to the point in which we think more individuals probably get to know about these issues in the first place. So a lot of minority issues are often overlooked in the status quo. We change by having more people talk about them. But lastly, we didn't get political lobbying in places like Parliament where we can actually create change. The point at which you were able to focus your resources as a minority movement, collectivize, and move on. I think ours is one that uniquely afforded you change. Ours is one that allowed you to create a different world. Ours is one that allowed you to revolve for citizens' OG.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for that speech. I'd like to call upon Yellow to close the opening half of the debate.
I left my water outside.
Hello. Okay. Very glad to be here. POS preferably from my diagonal. Science speech in 3, 2, 1. The answer to convincing people isn't to scream into the void of political schizophrenia. You cannot give the opposition a single reason to screw you over, and you cannot grow flowers with thunder. It is only rain that breeds growth. Here's why I'll go the long mile to prove why we are able to protect the most vulnerable stakeholders at worst, and then how we are still able to achieve some degree of higher discourse and we reach more people at best, and why is it so that opposition doesn't really prove what they want to prove in today's debate. So how I'm going to structure my speech is then very simple. On one, a third argument, before moving into weighing and responses that also integrate some degree of outframing for both closing houses then. But then let's move on to the third argument, on why desensitization via demonization is going to be more likely to occur, especially when the whole chunk of OG's case is to try and explain as to how discourse is going to be able to achieve, like being able to achieve more people. So, one, individuals kind of hate engaging in controversial social issues because of how the discourse is structured. We have to realize that most of the discourse that exists, like on their side of the house, is inherently negative. So what that then means is that, two, take Reddit, Twitter, etc. These are examples that they give in their speech. And PM concedes to how that the people who engage on these platforms are likely to be very much vocal about their own stance, and they are very much going to be arguing. What does this imply? It implies that the critical mass that you intend to achieve by convincing people who are inherently value neutral simply don't exist on these social media platforms by virtue of the fact that they are just an outsider, secluded group of individuals who don't necessarily already interact with these really deep entrenched echo chambers that exist. But even then, we just have to realize that if an individual isn't really concerned in social issues, then there is going to be an inherent failure to consume said information if it isn't contingent on that negative discourse that literally is used to argue even further by people who already have a stance. A very simple thing that we have to understand here is that Twitter threads are filled with people who already have opinions arguing even further. So what they do on their side of the house is that even if you are unsure of what this necessarily means, the ability for you to opt in then becomes even worse. I'll explain this even further. But then what's the consequence? One, you essentially take away the capacity for positive dissemination of information to reach. What does this look like? It looks like things such as fact files. It looks like things such as positive lectures that exist in things like university spaces and stuff like that to actually take precedence over the negative social media discourse that they intend to push. Because note how, like, what their best case is that the dissemination of negative information and people arguing in a very doomerous light is still going to be the precedent over like people going to actual sessions or seminars to learn about things where they aren't going to be pressured into trying to pick a stance. Now, how does OO fix this? Advocacy. Even if it's slow, the capacity for you to have better discourse is inherently higher because you don't crowd out the ability for people to actually try and learn about these social issues. I'll do a little more weighing further in my direct responses and call-outs. But then let's move on to the first layer of responses. One, why is it that OG gives further rise to desensitization? One, this directly contends with the entire chunk of better discourse that they want to argue on side government as a whole. So note that PM doesn't actually give you any link on how more discourse is directly equating to more awareness and it equals to more opt-in. But here's the simple reality, even if they want to say, okay, there's people who are going to be opting into both sides and that's still okay. One, as long as there's people taking a side, you don't really prove the scale of what it exactly looks like. Does it mean there's more right-wingers opting in than people people who support the social justice movements? It isn't really clear, and they don't necessarily explain how this necessarily shapes the culture that they intend to achieve. But how does OO impact this even further? One, your attention will always be negative at best outside OG. They do no claim into trying to say how their advocacy is about to shine in, or how it's about to even give the positive discourse that my first speaker has already told you. But also number two, know that more people on OO are able to learn about what your movement actually wants, because discussions are more likely to be able to spur better in the instance where you aren't focusing on attempting to demonize individuals because of the things that they are saying or doing. Because note, the people that you always demonize and whatnot are only going to opt in precisely because of fear or because they don't want to be called a bigot. But what the response from that is that the end goal of that is still to gain education. So if you want to be able to educate them in the first place, I don't understand then why you want to go through the long line of demonization instead of just allowing them to naturally opt in. Because even if the scope of this is way shorter, we ensure that we have better quality supporters in the long term. But then before I move on to number two, any PRs?
Are victims under social issues not have any form of urgency?
No, we are saying that victims under social issues will most likely already take a stance in the first place, so I don't get why that's the POI that you want to come up with. But also number two, let's talk about the contradiction that comes out in Ethan's speech, notably about why that cultural change argument just goes to bust. One, if you're allowing people to take a soft stance when you're opting in, it doesn't just mean you have a lower magnitude. It just means that you don't have change. Because any form of high quality discourse that you want to have is always going to be contingent on people who have a strong stance on these issues, who are going to be consistently willing to voice out. So what Marxist revolution are you trying to achieve is something that we don't get. But also number two, if you opt into the movement and you realize that it's something that's not from you, and you only opted into it simply because you are demonized to do so, and you don't actually have any degree of information, what that means is that in an instance where you want to opt out or potentially remain neutral, you are unable to do so, because the people within the movement itself are going to demonize you even further, and that makes you feel even more alienated within the movement, so you just don't get any form of positive change. But it also means that number three, this also helps us way over opposing, which they want to POI about how you are able to gain protection by virtue of the fact that when one person comes out, 5,000 other people are going to demonize you. We tell you that on our side of the house, we just tell you off the bat that if you don't want to pick a stance, you just don't have to, and you don't have to constantly defend yourself. So number three, why is it that political parties silencing people isn't necessarily something part of today's debate, but even if that is the case, why is this symmetric on both sides of the house? One, the reality is that political parties are already going to suppress you by virtue of you being an opposition or a social justice movement. So what that then means is that they want to say that the backlash that you gain without demonizing, if the backlash that you gain without demonizing is going to be better, It's something that I just don't get, because the drift is that backlash is going to be symmetric at best. The worsen on side of government when they are the ones who constantly support you, going out and demonizing other people, which gives them another opportunity to demonize you even further and vilify you, which makes it so that polarization grows even worse. So political ammunition will always grow on their side of the house, but know that in the instance where we do not convince, we are the only side that is able to convince the politically neutral into ensuring that you don't end up getting hated. With that, we say side with OO. Thank you.
Thank you, Diallo, for your speech. To begin the closing half of the debate, I'd like to call upon the Member of Government here.
Hey, you came in? I don't know, man. I think I'm reading.
Or should I be on the comments?
Your mic is not on.
Can I check if I'm audible at this volume?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. It appears I have to do it first and first. Okay. Okay. For pronunciation today, verbal POS, please, from the diagonal. Okay. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Violence is not born on the doorsteps of someone stabbing you in the face. Violence is born on the doorsteps for those who do not speak up for the suffering around them. And we tell you then that it is utterly unjustified to not call out someone for, let's say, bullying a person. And if you support that this principle exists in the first place, then it is principally unjustified from the very get-go to remain silent about issues around you. Very, very proud to propose. But let's just deal with very first thing. Government has has two very important burdens. And firstly, why it is justified to cause this demonization and coercion that we don't think is proven under their side of the house. Here's also a mitigation and a preemption for what CO might say about coercion being something that vilifies and is unjustified towards these individuals who cannot make a decision. We tell you here that people eventually must make a decision anywhere, where I think that where opening opposition is already concedes that there's some form of change within at least some form of long term, you realize that then social change occurs under critical, when the social movement has critical mass. We think that here the problem is just status quo is very slow. It's not enough at all. And people suffer within status quo, and the longer that you drag out this problem, the longer that they have to suffer. Time is of the essence. I'm saying that there's urgency within these people. The question now becomes, is it justified to speed up this process under the trade-off of coercion for these individuals? And we tell you, I'll give you 3 reasons why. Firstly, it's obviously just the urgency of the individuals at hand. Women are constantly suffering under patriarchy and such issues. Secondly, there's an infinite amount of people who can and may suffer within that period of time that you drag it out. And there is an infinite amount of suffering that is possible within that given period of time. Thirdly, change is slower. And we think that there's faster amounts of change. And we think that faster change means it makes room for greater amounts of change where one process and one radical creation of a new policy is able to make way and become the gateway for even more amounts of policies. And we think that this sort of evolution is what is absolutely necessary in order to progress a society as soon as possible. We think that for these reasons, right, it is necessary to buy government case just purely by the premise of what the motion states. Sure, PY.
As a minority, I have very little power to change things on both sides of the house. Why is it then that you feel the need to personally attack people for something they can't even change themselves?
It's precisely because of the collectivism that occurs under this, right? We identify that there's a trend currently in status quo that has an increasing amount of individuals opting into such social movements. The question is just when. That's why we answered that question. Thanks for the PY. Okay, second thing is just OO.
all gives us this complete engagement under the worst case, where everyone does like this desensitization, all of this sort of stuff. Essentially, it boils down to just extremely terrible discourse and an even greater social pressure by fear that this disincentivizes these individuals into like expressing their opinions, right? Note now that the case immediately falls when you realize that all of these things are symmetrical. Desensitization is already very prevalent in society when people are being bombarded with the sheer amount of social issues and the sheer amount of opinions that they see on social media. The scale of information is symmetrical on both sides insofar as to say that then desensitization is also symmetrical. Second thing is just on social pressure by fear. And we think that this is exactly the same, right? You want to say that there's even greater social pressure by fear, but I want to flip this. Note now that the reason why there's social pressure and people don't opt into expressing their opinions in the first place is precisely the reason that when they express their opinions, they eventually face opposition from those who oppose their opinions, right? We think that then people take the safe option of not opting into an opinion. We think that here we're able to flip this because when the fear is contingent on making an opinion on the opposition house, there is precisely this demonization that is contingent on not expressing your opinion that forces these people out of their shell. And we tell you that this incentive will further be analyzed in another extension later about the incentive. Third thing on discourse. They tell us that we're going to get like further and worse discourse, right? But the question here is just whether like worse discourse is actually worse. In which case we tell you firstly, discourse is pretty much symmetrical. Greater polarization in status quo is already a very big problem that causes people to be unable to agree on issues. We don't think people are going to agree at any point on issues, and we never conceded that, and neither did OG. What we are trying to say is that there are people who don't recognize that Israel and Palestine are going through a 300-year conflict. There are people who have absolutely no idea about the type of suffering that women go through on a day-to-day basis. And it is these individuals, these people who couldn't care less, is these people who don't know that we are trying to incentivize. We think that then we actually flip this discourse by saying that yes, there is discourse, perhaps it is worse. But even if it is worse, it calls awareness to the problem, and that awareness alone is what wins us this debate. Sure.
How is personally attacking someone and telling them to blame if they don't do anything about the Israel-Palestine conflict going to make them more likely to opt into learning about the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Okay, I'll give you the incentive analysis right now. Note now that there's an incentive for the individual to avoid ostracization, and we think that everyone roughly agrees on this. We tell you that then, when they are ostracized for not expressing their opinions, it is precisely then that the incentive changes. How do I minimize the amount of ostracization I get? And the way that this occurs is by virtue of wanting to learn more, in knowing what is the more correct side, what is the side that they most abide with and can defend the most, right? And we think it is by these mechanisms that creates the precise incentive change necessary for individuals who would otherwise not opt into expressing opinions into not only informing themselves, which is the analysis that OG lacked, but also at a very, very large scale to show you why the information that they are going to get is one that is personalized enough to their own context to create their own situation in one that is personal to them. We think that here the impacts are very simple, and the way that we weigh over OG is also very simple, right? We tell you that when OG doesn't explain to you the incentives of individuals, they can't actually prove to you at any point how any of their mechanisms like manifest, in which case the incentive is absolutely necessary and important in order to understand why people break out of this shell that they are unwilling to break out in the first place. Sure. Proper proposal.
Thank you, Member of Craft. Member of Craft.
It's so hot!
The mic is off.
Hello? There you go. Okay. Give me a second. Okay, yeah, before anything, some shout outs because I am so grateful. Shout out to Ryan, and Umar. Thank you guys for coaching me. I'm trying my best to make you proud. Thank you guys, KFDI. Give me already. For me, Glennis, Mary, Jack, and Owen. Thank you guys for coming here to support me. I love you guys. Thank you to my family who's here watching us today. I'll do my best. And last of all, and most importantly, thank you to my teammate Joel. I am so glad that we made it this far. Let's make it a good run. Let's go! Wait, timer. This is oral lost, guys. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Since no one in this debate wants to take a hard stance on what demonization actually is, maybe some demonization is required. Because I want to tell you at the top of this speech what demonization actually looks like. It looks like systematically acting against someone who is taking a neutral stance. It looks like being hateful towards them. It looks like telling them that you are directly responsible for the cause of this social issue if you do not actively take a stance, that you are complicit or that you are actively causing this issue to get worse. It looks like taking action against them to the point of making threats against them. It looks like making them it looks like doing things to specifically make them severely uncomfortable, or just not listing all kinds of negative feelings. Onto three things then, I'm going to do a brief house by house takedown. I'm going to spend 3 minutes on this, and I'm going to be giving you 2 extensions to clearly differentiate from OG on how minorities are going to be caught between a rock and a hard place, and on the principle of choice and how people literally just don't need to take a stance if they don't want to. Onto OG then, on the change and discourse factor, because they want a really soft case and they don't want to actually tell you what demonization looks like. They are out of the debate insofar as they only really want to debate on their best case. They tell you that this will be done in a healthy manner. Look me in the eye. You know that it's not true. You know that if you literally go out in the world and experience this for a day, you don't know that this isn't true. If you only want to argue in your best case, then I want to take this down now. Because here's some analysis of why this kind of demonization and the discourse is likely going to be really negative. We tell you firstly that people would like to feel morally superior and that they want to take a moral high ground. If they are acting against someone who they feel is morally inferior to them, they are more inclined to be hateful, they are more inclined to act in ways that are borderline ad hominem to make sure that this person actually understands that you are morally inferior to the person that is taking the high ground. But then secondly, we tell you that it's just really easy to fall into extremism when you allow people to demonize these people, because people are inherently selfish and individualistic. They inherently can take these problems to the worst extent, and that's something that's very likely to happen insofar as things like bullying cases and things like other forms of hatred against other human beings exist to such a high extent in status quo. You cannot tell me that everyone is going to sit down at the round table and have a perfectly healthy, productive discussion. That's not how this works. And honestly, the problem with this is that the rest of their argumentation only relies on the discourse being 1, good, and 2, productive. On to political literacy then, we think that we are willing to trade this off. We think that the ability for a person to make the choice free of coercion from a far more powerful movement is really important. And we think that we are able to, even if we have a lower level of political literacy, that we are okay with that. We tell you also, I just don't really know why I can't have this on my side of the house, right? Because CG concedes to you that society is becoming more progressive, that people are generally becoming educating themselves about these matters. So I don't know why these can't exist to the same extent on our side of the house. Onto how the stance doesn't need to be extreme, right? I think a choice needs to be made here. If the change is not extreme, if you're only posting about Palestine on your story, then the amount of change that you garner from your ideology is not going to be extreme. You're not going to obtain your benefits to the same high extent that you need to be able to have any change. So we understand that for the purposes of this debate, that if someone wants to take a stance, that they probably would have to take a very fixed and very vocal stance about matters. And also onto CG, right? Because I don't want to spend too much time. I think they're largely derivative on awareness and on change. They tell you one unique contribution is that change is faster. Again, I don't really care. If the discourse, this is something that only matters if the discourse is good, and government only needs to engage on their best case here, right? If they want to tell you the discourse is likely to be good and productive, I will tell you that it's the biggest lie, and then you probably just the discourse is 100% inclined to be negative. But then how people are being taken out of the shell and are more inclined to disagree if you are actively demonizing them. Again, I just don't understand how this is an argument even worthy of being in debate land. On to 2 extensions then. Firstly, on how minorities are being caught between a rock and a hard place. We think that this extension is specifically round waiting for CO, because we show you that people simply cannot speak up at some points, and at the point at which you force them to take a stance by demonizing them to the extent where they're unable to function, unable to feel safe and feel secure. We tell you that's the point where you touch them between a rock and a hard place. 3 layers. Firstly, on why this happens, I'm going to be using an intuition path to assist of how a woman exists under a patriarchy, or how a closeted queer person exists in a homophobic environment. We tell you that women in the in the feminist movement are actively subjugated by patriarchy, or that people who are identified as queer are usually live in homophobic countries that are unable to that do not support them and vocally commit crimes against gay people. We tell you that these social issues face heavy contention and polarization as the status quo, as in literally the motion on how these social issues are controversial. We tell you that these people have to remain neutral because of safety, and they cannot voice out about these things because they specifically need to maintain that kind of level of safety that make sure they don't literally get hate crime or they don't get vehemently opposed by people who already are against the movement in status quo. This is uniquely worse under government, where the people under the movements that support these things, such as the feminist movement or the queer movement, are also antagonizing people who do not want to take a verbal stance, right? Because these two things are going to happen. Firstly, if they do end up coming out or they said go out and publicly say that they support this movement, then they're likely going to face antagonism from the dominant narrative, or people who are homophobic or people who are misogynistic. They're likely going to face opposition from this. I'm going to talk about why this is so important later. But then secondly, if they do remain neutral, they now experience pressure from the communities that both the community that subjugates them and the community that is supposed to be fighting for what they need. Because now people are allowed to demonize these people into submission and make sure that they are unable to make sure that they're either forced to take a stance or just have to bear this kind of abuse. But also being systematically demonized by the queer community. But then on to the impacts, right? Because we tell you three things. Firstly, on choice. Because not every minority wants to be an advocate. Some of them just want to go to the grocery store. We tell you too that these minorities are more likely to feel isolated and feel miserable because your community, your own community, people who are supposed to heavily support you, do not want to now. Thirdly, we tell you that you take away the ability for minorities to move up in society or any kind of agency they have at the point at which they are forced to have vocal support for these for their communities, because people women who publicly support the feminist movement have quite literally been fired from their jobs or barred from promotion because they support the feminist movement. People are more likely to get hate crime if they vocally come out as queer as compared to the assumption that you'll never know. The comparative then is that these people literally just don't have to take a verbal stance on outside of the house. Why is this important to the round? We always see Jim who tells you that change is less likely to happen now, because even if it does happen on their side of the house, it comes at the cost of people who literally cannot come out or proclaim themselves to be feminists for safety reasons. And even if we have less change, we think this is most important to the round because we provide agency for those who are actually the most vulnerable. Onto the principal obligation then, and why this is true. Because people don't have to care about things that don't affect them. They either have no information on the topic, and there's some reason, for some reason, why Singaporeans don't care about Malaysian issues. Secondly, they have very little power to change things. People already feel apathetic and feel like they can make no change. If they cannot make an impact, they should be allowed to not care. And thirdly, the primary right of someone is to self-actualize. They have their own problems, and they don't understand why they have to worry about others and if it harms their ability to be happy. If I want to buy a car instead of donating to harmless children, that is my right to do so, even if that choice is not necessarily the best choice. If the work is not about self-actualization, let's all take off our clothes and donate them to charity. This is not emotionally proximate also, right? Because it's not your loved one in these experiences. And it directly connects with our worst case in here, because still that people don't care. Even if we have no practical impacts on the rights of individuals, still matter regardless. Because people now don't feel personally impacted and are more likely to listen when you get into opt in the things using messages that appeal to their empathy. CG concedes this, OG concedes this, we think this point at which CO gets first. Here we go.
Thank you, member for that speech. I'd like to call upon the government to carry on.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG takes this debate for two reasons. Firstly, we bring limelight to issues that require urgent attention, and second, even in our worst case scenario, we prove to you why individuals outside the house are more informed and more likely to care about important issues which is important for change in the long term. Very proud to propose. I'm going to first engage with side of opposition and what points coming for them, right? Firstly, they tell us how people it's better to let people opt into these things, into these social People have no incentive to research about these social issues in the first place, which is already proven to by Rayon why it's important to garner attention in the first place for these issues. But on the other side, people have no incentive and no likelihood to actually care about these issues that are not personal to them, right? But on our side of the house, we sit and tell you the importance and the urgency, which is why the urgency of issues such as people in Palestine who are dying and are suffering, where millions of people are dying on a daily basis. And that is why it's important to garner issues and give people incentive to care about these things, to garner the manpower and limelight for them to actually garner change, right? But secondly, they say that they have better informed people or whatnot because people are not constantly attacking each other. But we say that that's not true because on our side of the house, where we actively demonize these people and families and friends actively put pressure and give them urgency onto these people who actually make a decision and make their stance, right? They'll actually have the incentive to read up about these issues and study about these current facts, right? They can't just take us at our words and say that these people are just gonna keep on hiding and keep on like internalizing whatever opinions they have, right? Because we have to concede that at our best, right, people are still, because of this external pressure and because of this urgency, they will have the incentive to read up on these issues and study about current affairs. So what do we get out of this? Our best case scenario is that people will actually be informed about these issues, and by demonizing them, we actively give people a path to actually express their opinions, right? Because it's not normal for people to now like internalize whatever opinions and what stance they take, right? Because people actively have the incentive to learn, social movements will have the incentive to campaign more and advocate more. Why? Because in the past, in their world, in like social movements don't care about people who are neutral because they are neutral. But then on our side house, where people actually get demonized for these issues, these social movements or whatnot know that there are people right now studying about what side to take, right? This means that they will put more effort, put more money, and put more time into campaigning and try to attract these people who are on the fence on ourselves, meaning that we give out these social movements will more likely give out more facts, more evidence to support why they took this stance or whatnot, which means that people on our side house get better information, better discourse, and there's better social movements, and people are just more better informed on our side house. The scale of impact is much larger than on our side house because we're actually bringing awareness to these issues, right? You can't, although they say discourse might be unhealthy on our side house, we say that we'll trade it off and say that this bad discourse is better than no discourse at all on your side of the house, because at least we're pulling attention to these issues. We're actually encouraging people to think that, because these people are fighting about this certain topic, right, and this controversial issue, it will attract more viewers and more attention to these current issues, which is a benefit that is exclusive on our side of the house. But moving on to side CEO and like CLPHS, right? Firstly, they spend a lot of time telling us about what demonization is, but we never have disagreed with what like the context or the characterization of demonization in the first place. What we say on our side of the house is that it's justified to demonize people. It's justified to make them feel like that it's wrong for them to not take a stance, right? Because of the scale of harm and the necessity and the urgency that we have already proved to you in my like rating speech, right? Even if they do feel like scared or whatever, we say that it's essential for like social policies to be pushed or whatnot that we already have proven in our speech, right? But the second thing, which is the main push coming from side of CO, right? They say that it's unjust for like people to face antagonism and become ostracized in their communities right now. But they say number one, it's worse on your side of the house because people have to suffer in silence. They have to continue listening to their family members and friends and whatnot, like constantly shit about the things that they believe in, and when they're in these minority communities, they have to suffer alone and in silence, right? Which is bad on your side for these individuals. But on our side, where people actively demonize and people start to slowly speak out about these issues, right? They'll find their communities, they'll find that I'm not actually alone, or I'm not actually alone in this world. I'm not the only one who feels this way, right? There'll be people supporting them, and they'll realize that there is a community in friends and families that I can rely on, and this is a benefit that's also exclusive on our side of the house. If everyone demonizes these people, we're able to actually, if everyone starts demonizing it and becomes more like normalized for people to have different opinions on whatnot outside the house, it'd be more likely that family members or whatnot would just not just like shun their child for having this opinion or that opinion, right? What's likely going to happen on our side of the house is that people are likely to slowly evolve to become more accepting on our side of the house because they realize that people are not just like have one mindset, right? They have different opinions and that should be normalized, right? That is what's going to happen on our side of the house, and you can't just take us at a worst case where family members are actually just going to shun them just for having like certain controversial issues, right? You're feeling like it's normalized to have people that have different opinions and whatnot. And the whole CO case just has been a negative one, right? You never engage with us about how our benefits materialize, but we really give you process analysis of how, at the worst case scenario, we do gain awareness and we do gain like a limelight for these important issues. So what is the impact what is the main impact coming from closing government, right? On our side of the house, we tell you that number one, we get more discourse because people just generally discuss about these issues even more. But secondly, people feel more pressure to make a decision, which is important because it's principally unjust to control the people who stay silent and when people are actively suffering on like in the status quo, right? We say that with demonization, like even if we have a trade-off the comfortability of like a person, right? We say that in the long run, even if it's a share or if there's a like on Instagram or is it just like meet like this like small discussions within friend groups, we say that overall we garner change and garner attention to these movements, which will eventually lead to the long-term impact of like helping on these issues, right?
Thank you, Jeffrey, for that speech.
Joa Marisa lihat siangin.
We're losing. We're losing. The judges is the loser.
Is it okay if I speak at this volume? Alright, so to KFDI to launch Tunisia to Sarawak. It is shocking how little depth the opening half has had thus far. Because I don't think this debate should be about posting Instagram chain reactions of supporting Palestine. It's not about repost this if you love Palestine. These are not the stakeholders we ought to care about. We ought to care about the closeted individual in a missionary school who has two situations. A, that they say they're homophobic, go home and hate themselves. Or B, they say that they publicly support gay people and they're ostracized from their friend group the day after. These are the people we ought to care about. We ought to care about the woman who, because she took a stance on feminism, will never get promoted, or because she said she wasn't a feminist, will be demonized by her fellow women. These are the people we ought to care about, and it's only Site CO who actually provides recognition on how we don't harm them. I'll be taking down house by house by giving you analysis on how we outweigh each other. Let's start with OG, because OG gives you a few funny arguments. They tell you mostly three things. Firstly, they tell you that people are more aware of social issues. B, that people are more empowered to speak out. And 3, how you have access to information and attention on social issues. Also more aware of social issues. Note that this was never proven, panel, because it's an assumption that the public perception will be positive. And they tell you that they help minorities. But let's just talk about minorities. Their only engagement with forcing minorities to take a stance is we don't care, because you ought to empower yourself and create a culture of revolution. We tell you specifically how you harm them. because their rights are the minority, right? You ought to be prioritizing the person that you're advocating for. But the point in which minorities are forced to take stances that will get them harm in status quo, that is when you completely abandon them just for the sake of your ideological perception that you were probably never going to achieve in the first place. But secondly, they tell us about this cultural revolution and the fact that more people are empowered to speak out. Firstly, at the very least on the principle level, people should not be used as a means to an end. You ought to be treated just as you are. If you want to make a choice, but you don't have any moral culpability in things that are going on, you should not be blamed for not wanting to make that decision. But B, we flip this, right? Because we say that people are less likely to speak out. When a gay person speaks out on LGBT, when a woman speaks out because they are forced to on feminism and they take a feminist stance, but they are fired from work the next day, we say that other individuals are less empowered to speak out. Because once you notice that the people who speak out are hate crime, are passed over for promotion, and are utterly ostracized and criticized in status quo, that is the point in which you are less likely going to speak out. But fourthly, on access to information and attention on social issues. This rests under the fundamental assumption that information that is online is something that is good. We're here to tell you that it's not good. And note that this is exclusive to CO. When people often want to talk about social issues, the information available online is messy and convoluted. By virtue of it being a controversial issue, we tell you that the discourse that happens is often unproductive because people use emotional rhetoric to appeal to people's emotions. You do not spotlight an issue by pouring kerosene oil. You do not spotlight an issue by making it so messy and convoluted that people just go in and hate on each other all the time, and all you get is just unproductive discourse, and at the end of the day, people just feel worse about themselves. Onto CG then. I think they'll be quick to take up because they're mostly derivative of OG. They tell you mostly two things. Firstly, on productive discourse and awareness, and secondly, on the justification as to why people ought to be morally obligated. Firstly, on productive discourse and awareness. Firstly, just like their opening bench, this was never proved. But even if it was productive, and let's buy that base case here, you never said why you protect minorities. You never said why you give the chance for the person who wants to exercise their agency by keeping shut on feminist issues because they want to get promoted. You never protected the rights of these people. But secondly, onto the justification then. Note, right? In debates, if you want to justify a principal outcome, you cannot use utilitarian metrics. Things like urgency and things like making things better is utilitarian. You never prove why people ought to care about it for one, and you find they're obligated to care about something that never affected them. But secondly, their mechanism for why people are going to be informed is extremely funny. Their mechanism goes like this, you receive hate, you don't want hate anymore, and that's why you learn about it to stay educated. Note, taking a stance is different from staying informed about the issue. CG provides the analysis to prove why people will take a stance, but they never provided analysis to prove why people will get informed. Yeah, sure, you force people to take a stance, but you never prove why people are going to be more informed about it. What you're likely going to do is create a culture of where people are just going to simply take stances because they are forced to and be aligned with people who they took the stance with. And that is the reason why people are becoming increasingly more and more polarized, and they are not likely going to listen to anything around them. But I'm going to move on to why we outweigh all now. All is completely problematic. Because note, most of their arguments miss analysis that only we were able to provide. They never explain why people feel personally attacked, why people feel mad or scared when you demonize them. We're the only ones that say that it's because you antagonize them, right? It's because you make them feel like they're to blame for these social issues. It's because you make them feel like if they didn't do anything, they will be the perpetrator, and that is when people feel the edge of wrongful blame, and that is why they get angry. But secondly, on negative discourse, their mechanism on this is that people are going to be more entrenched in their beliefs when they were on the fence because you push them to take a stance. Note, if people were on the fence, it is logical to assume that they never had a belief in the first place. But secondly, it's just the wrong mechanism. Because we explain specifically why people feel antagonized and feel to blame. That is why they are likely going to have negative discourse. Not because they become more entrenched in their beliefs, but because they never took a stance and they feel pressured to, and they feel attacked because they think that just because I don't want to take a stance, I'm not responsible for the war that's going on in Gaza. But lastly, they never explain why people can be more informed on their side of the house. Because they say that if you don't demonize others, they are going to be more informed. But the mechanism is contingent on there being positive discourse, which they never prove. We're the only side that told you that people are already wanting to be more progressive because there's a shift towards progressivity. But the minute you personally attack them, they're only going to turn away or become more apathetic towards social issues. What are our unique contributions then, and why are arguments more important? Firstly, because we protect the more vulnerable stakeholder. I think it's logical to assume that we should not be protecting the local layman here. Because I think attacking Taylor Swift for not taking a stance is not what we should care about. We should be caring about the people who are most impacted by having to take a stance. We trade better info off if we are the only ones who let people be neutral. But B, we also explain things independent of outcome. So we explain, even with any positive outcome that we can get on the side of OG, the fact that we've already proven why people don't need to take a stance, because they're not proximal to it, because they have their own problems and they shouldn't have to expend emotional accountability and feel to blame for things that aren't even their fault. That is why they shouldn't have to take a stance, even if it will result in better outcome. What's our solvency then? We tell you that people are already open to listening because there's already a shift with things like social activities, and things like celebrities providing stances on these things. We explain that people should not be forced into doing this. If they want to take a stance, then let them take a stance. But don't shift them into a cycle of unproductive discourse just because you want urgency to happen now. Panel, social change is slow for a reason. The rights of people are not to be trifled with. We should not blame people into taking stances that they never had to in the first place oppose. Yeah.